I'm Emily Carter. I'm 27 years old. And 1 year ago, I was lying in an ICU bed, my vision blurred, my breathing shallow, and my body failing organ by organ. What began as a flare-up from lupus turned into full systemic collapse. The doctors told my parents plainly, she might not make it through the night. Their response, we can't miss James's engagement party. And just like that, they left me hooked to machines, fighting to survive completely alone. That moment didn't just break my heart, it changed the course of my life. Before I tell you what happened next, and how the letter I wrote afterward reclaimed everything they tried to erase, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever felt invisible to the people who were supposed to love you most, hit like, subscribe, and stay. This story was made for you. I grew up in Scottsdale, Arizona, in a house that looked perfect from the outside. A neat two-story colonial with cream stucco walls and navy shutters, tucked into a quiet cul-de-sac with wide sidewalks and desert plants trimmed like sculptures. My father, Stephen, worked in finance and played golf every Sunday. My mother, Karen, kept the home immaculate and the fridge organized by color. We had everything people associate with security, stability, success. But inside, something quieter was always missing. My older brother, James, was the sun around which everything revolved. 3 years older than me, he was the golden child from day one, tall, athletic, confident. By the time I was 6, he was already pitching for the local All-Stars. By the time I was 10, he was giving speeches at student council assemblies. James was the child people noticed, the one they pointed to and said, he's going places. In every framed photograph along our hallway, James stood in the center, always smiling, always lit just right. If I appeared at all, it was off to the side, half-turned, sometimes blurry, sometimes cropped. I used to think it was an accident, that I'd just moved at the wrong moment. But now, I know better. The camera never forgot me. It simply captured what had always been true. When James hit a home run in Little League, my parents took him out for dinner and ice cream. When I brought home a painting that won first place in the citywide art fair, they complimented it once and then asked if I'd cleaned my room. The imbalance wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, but it was constant. And that kind of consistency shapes you. When I was 14, James won his regional baseball tournament. My parents threw a backyard celebration with string lights, a catered taco bar, and enough guests to fill every lawn chair we owned. That same summer, I won first place in a statewide art competition. My certificate was pinned to the refrigerator with a, "That's nice, honey," before my mom asked if I was still struggling in algebra. At school, I was known for my illustrations and design work. Teachers encouraged me. Friends admired me. But at home, those things seemed to float in the background, like soft music beneath the soundtrack of James's constant victories. When I graduated from high school, I walked across the stage with my cap and gown pressed and ready. My grandparents came. They brought flowers and cried when I smiled for photos. But the 2 empty seats they'd saved in the front row, they stayed empty. James had a recruiting event that weekend, and my parents chose to go with him. That night, they sent a text. "James did great today. We're so proud of him. We'll celebrate your graduation when we get back." There was no celebration. I told myself I understood. James was older, that his opportunities were time-sensitive, that maybe next time they'd show up for me. But with every skipped event, every half-praise, every missed milestone, that hope thinned until it was nearly invisible. I didn't hate James. He didn't ask for the spotlight. But living in its shadow taught me early. There is a difference between being loved and being prioritized. And I was never the priority. Not then, and not for a long time after. In the fall of 2016, I left Arizona for Portland, Oregon, to attend college on a partial art scholarship. I chose a school that felt far enough to breathe, but not so far that it felt like running away. At the time, I still believed distance might help the dynamic shift, that adulthood would level the playing field. It didn't. That first semester, I called home every Sunday. I'd sit by the window in my dorm room, sketchbook open, phone pressed to my ear, eager to share the pieces I was working on. Sometimes I'd mention a professor's praise, or a small feature I'd earned in the campus exhibit. But those updates were always met with the same response. A distracted, "That's great, sweetie," followed immediately by, "Did we tell you James just made the dean's list again? He's looking at internships in New York." Every conversation drifted toward James, his law classes, his new apartment, the girlfriend they adored, Lily, who they referred to as part of the family before I'd even met her. I was a participant in these calls, but rarely the subject. It was like phoning into a newsletter I hadn't subscribed to. Even when I shared something truly important, the response felt measured, muted, like they were reading from a script that didn't include space for me. My junior year, I worked with a team to design the campaign visuals for a local nonprofit. The posters we created went up all over the city. The client loved our work so much that they submitted it to a regional design competition. We won first place. It was the biggest professional recognition I'd ever received. I called home, proud, hoping for a moment of real connection. My father answered. I told him the news, my voice light, a smile rising before the words even finished leaving my mouth. "That's great, honey," he said, without missing a beat. "Have you heard James just closed his first case? He's the youngest associate at the firm to do that." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. The next week, a package arrived. Not from my parents, from my grandmother. A small frame, wrapped in brown paper. Inside it was a printout of the campaign poster we'd submitted, neatly trimmed, and a handwritten note that read, "You've always made beauty out of silence." I cried harder over that note than I had over anything in years. Still, I kept trying. I sent thoughtful birthday gifts. I asked about their lives. I flew home for the holidays, even when I was exhausted from finals or sick with winter colds. I sat through dinners where the topic was always James, his court victories, his condo renovations, his plans to propose to Lily. I laughed at the right moments, nodded in support. I told myself this is what love is, showing up, even when you're not seen. The year James got engaged, they hosted a celebration dinner at a restaurant back in Scottsdale. Extended family, childhood neighbors, and even his old baseball coach attended. They toasted to his success, to Lily, to the life they were building. I had flown in just for the weekend, even rearranged a freelance deadline to be there. But by the time dessert was served, I realized something: no one had asked me a single question about my life. Not one. The next morning, over coffee, my mother said, "You should really think about coming back to Arizona. I'm sure there are some design jobs here. You could be closer to James, to family." I smiled politely, but inside, I felt the quiet thud of something final. The realization that being physically near them would never bring me closer to being understood. So I returned to Portland. I poured myself into my work. I started climbing at my agency, slowly but steadily. When I was promoted to senior designer after a national campaign we led received industry recognition, I sent my parents a message, short, hopeful. "Just wanted you to know we won the award. It's a big deal in our field." My father responded 2 days later, "That's great. Emily, did we tell you James and Lily just closed on their second property?" He's thinking of buying a vacation home next. The pattern hadn't changed. Only I had. And yet, I kept showing up because I thought that maybe, if I earned enough, achieved enough, proved myself enough, I might finally take up space in their story. I didn't know it yet, but that belief was the slowest kind of wound. One I had been tending my entire life, and it would take nearly losing everything to finally let it go. I was 19 when my body first began to whisper that something was wrong. At first, it was subtle, a kind of fatigue that lingered longer than it should have, a tightness in my joints after simple walks, fevers that came and went without warning. I brushed it off at first. College was stressful, and Portland winters were colder than what I was used to in Arizona. I assumed I just needed rest, better food, maybe more vitamin D. But the whispers grew louder. Some mornings, I couldn't lift my coffee mug without pain radiating from my wrists. On others, my knees felt swollen before I even got out of bed. There were days I pushed through because that's what I had always done, but they were becoming fewer. The exhaustion began to eat into everything: school, work, my ability to be present in my own life. I saw doctor after doctor, blood tests, physical exams, long silences as physicians tapped their pens and narrowed their eyes at results that didn't quite add up. It took 6 months of chasing answers before a specialist finally said the word I didn't know would change everything. Lupus, an autoimmune disease, lifelong, unpredictable, manageable, but never curable. I remember the moment so clearly, sitting in that cold exam room, hands in my lap, trying to wrap my mind around what it meant to live with a body that could turn against itself. The specialist explained the treatment plan, medications, monitoring, lifestyle changes. I nodded, took notes, asked questions, and then I called my parents. I told myself they would care, that this would be different. They answered on speakerphone. I could hear the clinking of dishes in the background. My voice was steady as I explained the diagnosis. I even tried to make it sound manageable, like something I could handle with the right support. There was a long pause. Then my mother said, "Are you sure it's not just stress? You've always been sensitive." My father added, "Maybe you're studying too hard, or not eating right. You always overthink things." M. That moment, that single moment, hurt more than the diagnosis itself, because it confirmed what I hadn't wanted to believe, that even when my body was failing, when I was scared, when I needed them, they still couldn't see me. They minimized it, just like they had minimized everything else. Over the next few years, as symptoms came and went in waves, they continued to respond with the same indifference. If I canceled plans because I was in a flare, they suggested I was being dramatic. If I mentioned pain or fatigue, they told stories of how James worked 60-hour weeks and never complained. It wasn't just invalidation, it was erasure. My illness became something I had to carry in secret, because the people who should have held space for it refused to believe it was real. I learned how to explain it to professors without sounding like I was making excuses. I learned to time my medications around client meetings. I learned to keep my emergency contacts up to date, because I couldn't count on my family to pick up the phone. I lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment, and some nights, when my fever spiked or the joint pain became unbearable, I'd lie on the bathroom floor and wonder, what if this gets worse and no one knows I still called my parents once a week, still asked about their lives, still listened to updates about James's rising career and Lily's boutique wedding plans. But I stopped telling them about my symptoms. I stopped hoping they'd change. Instead, I began managing on my own. Quietly, determinedly, I built systems, wrote down the side effects, set alarms for pills, kept hot packs in the freezer and spare pain medication by the bed. I did it all alone, because I had to. And still, a part of me clung to the hope that one day, just once, they'd call and ask how I was feeling. Not because it was convenient, not because they were prompted, but because they saw me. They never did. And what I didn't realize then was that one day soon, that denial, their refusal to see my illness, would almost cost me my life. And even then, they still wouldn't show up. After my diagnosis, life didn't slow down. It just changed course. I still had deadlines, bills, clients, and dishes in the sink. Lupus didn't pause the world. It just demanded more from me, more energy, more planning, more resilience. And I gave it all, quietly, every single day. But something else shifted, too. I started needing people in ways I hadn't before. That's when Maya Thompson entered my life. We met through a roommate listing two young women in their 20s, both working in creative fields, both looking to split rent in a neighborhood that didn't charge a small fortune. On paper, it was practical, but in reality, Maya became the closest thing I'd ever had to family. From the beginning, she noticed things no one else ever had. She could tell when I was pushing myself too hard, when I needed space but didn't know how to ask for it, when my joints were flaring before I said a word. She never made a big deal out of it, never pitied me, never treated my illness like a burden. Instead, she made space. Without prompting, she started researching lupus quietly, respectfully, so she could understand what I was living with. She kept a small notebook with reminders about my medications, emergency contacts, and warning signs. When I caught her updating it one evening, I asked, surprised, "Why are you doing all this?" She shrugged, smiled gently, and said, "That's what friends do." It was such a simple answer. But no one in my family had ever done what Maya did for me. Not once. There were nights I came home barely able to stand. Maya would already have a heating pad ready on the couch, herbal tea steeping in the kitchen, and the lights dimmed to ease my migraines. If I needed silence, she gave it. If I needed company, she sat beside me without filling the air with empty words. She learned the difference between tired and lupus tired. The kind that settles in your bones. The kind that doesn't lift, no matter how long you sleep. She saw it. She saw me. When I thanked her genuinely, repeatedly she'd wave me off. "Don't make it a big thing." She'd say, "We look out for each other." But it was a big thing. To be looked after. To be held in someone's attention with care. It was something I hadn't known I was missing until I finally had it. And it wasn't just Maya. Her boyfriend, Ryan, soon became part of the rhythm of our lives. Quiet, thoughtful, always noticing. If he were dropping by and I was having a flare, he'd bring soup without saying a word. He once fixed the squeaky bathroom door because he noticed I was waking up at night, and the noise made it harder for me to fall back asleep. These weren't grand gestures. They weren't performative. They were consistent. They were human. And in that small apartment with creaky floors and mismatched throw pillows, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Safe. Not because the pain went away, not because I wasn't still carrying the weight of a body that sometimes betrayed me, but because, for once, I didn't have to carry it alone. At night, I'd hear Maya in the kitchen, laughing softly with Ryan, music playing low in the background, and I'd think this is what it could have been. If my family had chosen to see me, if they had paused the James show for long enough to notice I was hurting, to care, but they didn't. And here, in this quiet space I never expected, someone else did. I didn't stop calling my parents. I still answered when they rang. Still listened to updates about James's court victories and Lily's Pinterest-worthy wedding plans. But each time, the distance between us widened, not just in miles, but in meaning. Because I had found something they never offered, a home that saw me, a friend who stayed, and soon, when everything collapsed, it wouldn't be my parents who saved me. It would be Maya, because family isn't always who you're born to. Sometimes, it's who shows up again and again when it matters most. It started like any other Tuesday. I woke up to the usual ache in my joints, nothing alarming, just the quiet hum of inflammation I'd come to expect on colder mornings. I took my meds with breakfast, brewed a cup of peppermint tea, and settled in to work from home. The light from the window was soft, and my sketch pad lay open beside my keyboard. I even remember feeling grateful for a stable morning, for Maya's note on the fridge reminding me to rest, for the stillness. But by noon, something shifted. The ache spread faster than usual, stretching from my shoulders to my knees, then down into my hands. My breath grew shorter, sharper, as if each inhale had to squeeze through walls that hadn't been there an hour earlier. I checked my temperature, 101.6. Not ideal, but not new either. I drank water, laid down, waited. By 2 o'clock, the fever hit 103. My vision blurred. My pulse thudded like a drum inside my skull. I reached for my phone and typed the words with fingers that barely moved. Having a bad flare. Fever 102. Can't breathe right. Might go to ER. I sent the message to both of my parents, hoping just this once that they'd hear the fear I didn't know how to say out loud. 20 minutes passed. Then the replies came. From my mom. Take some Tylenol and rest. You'll be fine by morning. From my dad. Remember when James had pneumonia during finals week? He still aced his exams. Mind over matter. Kiddo. I stared at those words for a long time. Not angry. Not even surprised. Just hollow. The fever climbed to 104. I stood up or tried to and nearly fell. My vision swam. The 12 steps to the bathroom looked like a marathon. I reached for my phone again. Maya was in Detroit that week for a client pitch. But I tried anyway. Not good. Really sick. That's all I could type before my hand dropped and the phone slipped from my fingers to the floor. I don't remember what came next. Time became slippery. Heat pulsed through every inch of me. My breath rattled in my chest, shallow and fast, like a bird flailing against a window. Somewhere in that haze, I heard the lock turn, a gasp, then a voice I knew as well as my own. Emily Maya. Her meeting had ended early. Her flight got in late, and for some reason she decided to stop by the apartment instead of going straight home. That decision saved my life. She found me on the floor, burning up, barely conscious. She pressed a cool hand to my forehead, then grabbed the phone with fingers steadier than I ever remembered seeing. I heard her voice calling 911, urgent, clear, trembling but focused. She has lupus. Yes. Autoimmune. Her temperature's 105. She's barely responsive. Please hurry. The ambulance ride was fragments. Sirens. Bright lights. Someone inserting an IV. A mask covering my mouth. And Maya's voice beside me, answering every question the EMTs asked. She had memorized my history, my medications, my emergency contacts. She never left my side. At the ER. The blur continued, doctors shouting orders, nurses moving fast, machines beeping warnings I was too weak to understand. Someone said the word sepsis. Another said multi-organ involvement. But none of it landed. All I could feel was the heat inside me and the strange coldness of being both alive and slipping away. Hours passed, maybe minutes. I lost all sense of time. But Maya never wavered. She stayed. Through every test, every scream, every spike in fever, while my body failed, she became my anchor. And somewhere between that hospital stretcher and the ICU doors, I realized something quietly devastating. My parents still hadn't called. Not once. No follow-up. No concern. Not even a question. The last thing they said was, "Take Tylenol." That was all I was worth to them. Meanwhile, Maya, who shared no blood, no obligation, was there, holding my hand while I fought to breathe. And in that moment, I understood. Family isn't about who you're born to. It's about who doesn't leave when things fall apart. And that night, I was falling apart in every way a person can. Physically, emotionally, and Maya. She stayed. The ICU was quieter than the emergency room, but it carried a different kind of weight. Every beep was sharper, every breath measured. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above me as nurses moved with quiet urgency. Machines wrapped around my bed like sentinels, tracking everything: my heart, my lungs, my blood. It was a room built for survival. But even in a room designed to keep me alive, I felt like I was disappearing. Maya had stayed until the early hours. She answered every question the doctors asked, repeated my history when new staff arrived, and made sure my hand never felt alone. By morning, she was slumped in the chair beside my bed, still in the clothes from her flight, eyes puffy from exhaustion. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten. She'd just stayed. When the attending physician, Dr. Ramirez, came in, she stood at the foot of my bed, reading the chart with a furrowed brow and steady calm. Her voice was soft but clear. "Emily, you're in critical condition. The lupus flare has triggered what we call a cytokine storm. It's a severe inflammatory reaction that's affecting your organs. Your kidneys are struggling, your liver's inflamed. We're doing everything we can, but tonight will be important. It could go either way." I nodded weakly, though even that small motion sent sharp pain shooting through my spine. My lungs still burned, each breath scraping like glass. Maya asked questions I couldn't. She wrote everything down, and then, when visiting hours began, the door opened, and for the first time since I'd texted them, my parents walked in. My mother wore a navy blouse, her makeup carefully done. My father still had on his work jacket. They looked casual, like they were arriving late to a dinner party, not entering the room where their daughter had nearly died. "You gave us quite a scare," my mom said, settling into the visitor chair with her phone still in hand. My dad stood by the window, occasionally glancing at the hospital television, where a baseball game played silently. They stayed for maybe 20 minutes, just long enough to shift the conversation to James. Of course, he had just proposed to Lily. The engagement party was in 3 days. My mother scrolled through venue photos, showing me table settings and floral arrangements as the heart monitor beside me clicked out my shallow rhythm. "It's going to be beautiful," she gushed. "The Hamiltons are coming. So are all of James's firm partners. You know, everyone will be there." She didn't ask how I was. "Not really." My father checked his watch. "We've got that meeting with the caterer at 6, he said quietly. They stood to leave. My mom adjusted her handbag. "We'll check in tomorrow," she said, already halfway to the door. "Just rest. You'll bounce back. No questions about my prognosis. No conversation with Dr. Ramirez. No recognition that they had nearly lost me." When the door closed behind them, the silence returned, and it was heavier than before. That evening, my vitals began to worsen. The fever spiked again. My blood pressure dropped. My breathing grew shallow. Dr. Ramirez ordered a second round of steroids and another scan. Maya held my hand as they prepped me for new tests. At one point, Nurse Angela came in. She'd been assigned to my overnight care. Quiet, older, with kind eyes and steady hands. She noticed things. How I flinched when they mentioned my parents. How I didn't talk much. Not because I was too weak, but because I had nothing left to say. Later that night, she brought an extra blanket, gently tucked it around me, and said, "You've got a good friend in that one. Better than some family I've seen." I managed to whisper, "She's the only one who came." Angela didn't say anything for a moment. Then she nodded. "It's not who shares your name, honey. It's who shows up." The next morning, Dr. Ramirez returned. Her expression was tense. "We need to move you back into isolation. Your oxygen is dropping. You're heading into organ stress." As the nurses began to prepare, I turned to Angela. Can you call my parents, please?" I still held on to that small thread of hope. That maybe this time, finally, they would come. That the word ICU would mean something. That they would drop everything and stay. Angela squeezed my hand gently. Of course. I watched the door close behind her as they wheeled me into the next room. Machines beeped, alarms clicked on, and all I could do was wait. Not just for the medication to work, but to see if anyone else would. The ICU at night is a strange kind of quiet, not peaceful, not restful, just waiting. I lay there beneath soft blankets, connected to lines and monitors that blinked out my vitals in steady rhythms. Oxygen whispered through the nasal tube, and even though the fever hadn't yet broken, the hallucinations had begun to fade. I was back inside myself, aware again, aware enough to feel the silence. I kept glancing toward the door. Every time footsteps echoed in the hall, I wondered, will it be them this time? And every time, it wasn't. Nurse Angela returned around 9:00 p.m. Her expression told me what her words didn't need to say. "I spoke to them," she said gently. "They're at James's engagement party, but they said they'd stop by after around 11 or so, maybe midnight." She said it like it was a schedule, as if showing up hours after their daughter's potential deathbed was part of a normal evening plan. Angela didn't try to hide her disappointment. She adjusted my IV slowly, then sat beside the bed. "Sometimes people show you who they are in a crisis," she said quietly. "It's hard when the people who should come running don't." I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I just nodded. The way you nod when the truth has finally worn its way through your skin and into your bones. Around midnight, the elevator camera outside the ICU lit up on the monitor behind the nurse's station. Angela glanced at it, then looked at me. "They're here," she said softly. I was already in the wheelchair. Discharge papers signed. Belongings packed. Maya waiting downstairs with the car. Angela had seen enough families like mine to understand when a patient didn't just need medical care, but an escape plan. She wheeled me quietly to the service elevator. I wore a hospital robe. My bag clutched tightly in my lap. The IV port, still taped to my arm, throbbed as we moved. "They just entered your room," Angela said, glancing at the monitor again. Empty bed, neatly made. No personal items. They looked confused. I didn't reply. But in my chest, something heavy started to lift. It was the weight of 27 years of trying to be enough, trying to be good, trying to be chosen. As Angela opened the exit door, I turned back for one last glance at the monitor. My mother stood beside the bed, holding a small plant from the hospital gift shop. My father was on his phone. James leaned in the doorway, scrolling, visibly annoyed. Angela squeezed my shoulder gently. "You don't have to keep carrying people who won't carry you back." I nodded, grateful not just for her words, but for her presence. 10 minutes later, I was in the car, wrapped in a blanket Maya had brought from home. She adjusted the seat warmer, placed a thermos of chamomile tea in the cup holder, and glanced over with eyes that had barely left me since Detroit. "You ready?" I looked out the window at the hospital fading behind us. "Yes," I whispered. More than ready. Not just to leave that room, but to leave the role I'd been cast in since childhood, the obedient daughter, the quiet shadow, the one who never asked for too much, the one who excused the inexcusable, rationalized the unkind, and held on longer than anyone should have to. That night, I left all of that behind, not out of anger, but out of clarity, because I finally understood you can't keep begging for love from people who only know how to look past you. You can't keep waiting at the door when they've already chosen the party, and you can't heal in the same place that broke you. So I chose differently. I chose peace. I chose people who stay. And for the first time in my life, I chose myself. The first week after leaving the hospital was a blur of sleep, medications, and silence. Maya had made up the spare room in her apartment fresh sheets, a diffuser with lavender oil, and a soft gray blanket folded at the foot of the bed. Every detail told me I was welcome, not tolerated, not accommodated, wanted. Ryan rearranged his schedule to be around in the afternoons. He brought groceries, filled my prescriptions, even fixed the creaky bathroom lock without a word. They didn't ask for thanks. They didn't expect anything. They just showed up. But even as my body began to mend, something deeper inside me stayed fractured. There were nights when I woke in a cold sweat, heart pounding, convinced I was back in that hospital room alone. Or worse, convinced my parents were still standing at the foot of my bed, smiling politely while checking the time. The physical wounds would heal, but the betrayal, that needed something more. So, 3 weeks after discharge, I scheduled a virtual appointment with Dr. Meera Patel, a therapist who specialized in chronic illness and family trauma. I found her name in a patient forum. People said she understood the kind of hurt that didn't show up on scans. At the start of our first session, she simply said, "Tell me about your family." And for the first time in my life, I did, fully, without shrinking it down, without defending anyone, without padding the truth with phrases like, "They meant well," or "It wasn't that bad." I told her about James, about the birthday parties I never got, the art competitions that earned fridge magnets while his baseball wins got banners and caterers, the graduation they missed, the scholarship they forgot to mention, and the night in the ICU when they chose shrimp cocktail and champagne toasts over my failing lungs. When I finished, Dr. Patel was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I didn't expect. "What you're describing is a very clear golden child, scapegoat dynamic." I blinked. "What?" She leaned forward slightly. "In many dysfunctional family systems, children are unconsciously assigned roles. The golden child is the one who can do no wrong. They receive the praise, the attention, the investment. The scapegoat is the child whose needs are minimized, whose experiences are questioned, and who often carries the emotional weight of the family's denial." Something cracked open inside me. She continued, These roles have nothing to do with the children's actual worth. They're assigned based on the emotional limitations of the parents. You weren't overlooked because you were less worthy. You were overlooked because they couldn't see past their need to uphold James's perfection. I sat with that. Let it wash over me like warm water after years in the cold. It made sense. It finally made sense. All those years I'd wondered what was wrong with me, why no achievement was enough, why no milestone brought them closer. It wasn't about me at all. It had never been. The most important thing to remember, Dr. Patel added gently, is that their failure to recognize your value does not mean you lacked value. You were always enough. They just never had the tools to see it. I didn't cry in that moment, but I carried her words with me, like a lifeline, like a seed. In the sessions that followed, we unpacked everything: the patterns, the silence, the misplaced guilt. I began to see that I had been chasing something impossible: love with conditions, approval tied to invisibility, connection built on compliance. And every time I tried harder, bent further, stayed quieter, I was feeding the very system that kept me small. Naming it didn't erase the pain, but it made the pain understandable. It gave it shape. It turned it from a fog into a form I could finally face. And from there, from that truth, healing could begin. Not just in my body, but in my spirit. Because I no longer believed the lie that said I had to earn love. I finally saw what Maya and Ryan had shown me all along. That real love doesn't ask you to disappear. It meets you, exactly as you are, and says, I see you. Stay. Healing is not a straight line. Some days, I woke up with a sense of peace I'd never known. Other days, the grief curled around my ribs like something alive, reminding me that even clarity doesn't erase longing. But with every breath that didn't burn, with every hour my joints stopped aching, I felt something slowly return, a sense of self, and with it came a choice. I could keep chasing what had always hurt me, or I could build something better. So I began. The first thing I did was change my phone number. A small act, but a powerful one. I shared it only with those who had proven, without words, that they knew how to show up. I set email filters. Anything from my parents' addresses went to a separate folder, one I could check when I had the strength. Not because I wanted to cut them out completely, but because I had learned that boundaries are not walls. They are doors, and I get to choose who walks through them. I blocked them on social media, removed the digital window into my life, not out of spite but out of necessity. Because every time they posted a smiling photo with James or praised Lily's latest career move without a mention of the daughter they nearly lost, it reopened something raw. Meanwhile, the people who had been there, really there, stayed close. My team at work arranged a meal delivery service, checking in weekly to see what I needed. Neighbors I barely knew slipped notes under Maya's door: flowers, herbal teas, soft blankets, and candles left with kindness. Each gesture whispered something I'd never heard enough growing up. You matter. Even as I healed, the guilt tried to return. That old voice in my head, shaped by years of comparison and dismissal, said, You're being dramatic. You're overreacting. They're still your parents. But Dr. Patel's words echoed louder. Love with conditions isn't love, it's control. And so, I kept walking forward. Maya and Ryan rearranged their apartment to give me space. Ryan built a standing desk in the corner of the spare room, perfectly measured so I could design without straining my still recovering body. Maya filled the fridge with easy meals. She hung a whiteboard near my bed to track meds and symptoms, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. This wasn't care born of obligation. It was care born of choice, and I'd never experienced that before. Work allowed me to go fully remote. I took on small projects, nothing overwhelming, just enough to stay connected to the part of myself that still believed in color, shape, and story. With each design I finished, I felt strength return, not just to my muscles, but to my voice. Al Ryan's younger brother dropped by one evening with Thai food from my favorite place. I hadn't mentioned it to him. He just remembered. I sat there, chopsticks in hand, surrounded by people who knew my pain and didn't flinch from it. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood at the window and looked out over Portland's quiet streets. The sky was clear, the air still, and I whispered something I hadn't said aloud since the ICU. Thank you for letting me stay. But I wasn't just surviving now, I was beginning to live. 3 weeks after discharge, I walked slowly, carefully into a bookstore around the corner. I bought a journal. The cover was deep green with gold-lined pages, and on the first page, in my still shaky handwriting, I wrote today. I choose peace over permission, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't asking to be seen. I wasn't waiting for applause. I wasn't hoping they'd notice. I was building something new, a life not dependent on their approval, a home filled with people who stayed, and a future I no longer felt guilty for wanting, because I'd learned something no one ever taught me. You don't need a perfect past to build a beautiful present. You just need people who choose you, and the courage to choose yourself. It had been 2 months since I left the hospital with Maya by my side. 2 months of rest, of therapy, of boundaries held and peace protected. My body was stronger, my voice steadier, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was living a life that belonged to me. That's when the email came. It was from my mother, sent not to my personal address, but to the general inbox at my company, a place she knew I would eventually have to check. The message was long, overflowing, filled with declarations of love, of concern, of confusion. She asked why I was punishing them, why I hadn't returned their calls, why I was shutting out the people who raised me. There were phrases like "we did our best and you're being unfair." There were paragraphs defending their choices, justifying the party, explaining the timing. But what stayed with me most was this line, "We love you, Emily, we always have. You just never seemed to notice." I read it 3 times, then closed my laptop and shook, not from anger, from recognition. Because that sentence was the clearest mirror of the problem. They believed love had been present all along because they had felt it. But love that doesn't land, doesn't count. And what I had felt for decades was not love. It was performance, conditional presence, a kind of hollow obligation dressed up as parenting. Still, part of me spiraled. Old instincts resurfaced. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was being too rigid. Maybe healing didn't have to look like silence. I brought the email to Dr. Patel. She read it carefully. Her face, as always, calm, steady. Then she asked, "Do you want to respond?" I nodded slowly, but not to explain, just to draw a line. So we crafted a reply, short, firm, without blame. "I'm safe. I'm recovering. I'm not ready for contact beyond this message. If I feel able to rebuild communication in the future, I'll reach out. Please respect this boundary." I sent it, then muted the inbox. The next reply came just hours later. Another long letter, this time more urgent, more insistent. It accused me of rewriting history, of being manipulated, of letting outsiders turn me against them. Every sentence carried an undercurrent. Come back to the story we created. Play your role. Don't make us the villains. But I didn't respond again, because I had learned something Maya once whispered to me while placing a heating pad at my back. You're allowed to leave the table when love is no longer being served. So I left. And for a while, silence returned. Then, in early spring, I received another message, this one different. It wasn't from my parents. It was from James. Unlike their emails, his was brief and quiet. Emily, I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the hospital, about a lot of things, actually. Lily pointed out some things I'd never noticed. I don't know if you want to hear from me, but if you do, maybe we could talk. No pressure. James. I stared at that message for a long time. He hadn't used his title, not Jamie, the name my parents used, not Attorney James Carter, just James. It didn't come with a defense or a plea. It came with a door cracked open. And I didn't know yet if I'd walk through, but I saved it. Because, unlike the others, it didn't demand, it acknowledged, and that, in itself, was a beginning. Not a reconciliation, not yet, but maybe just maybe a different kind of truth, one that could be rebuilt, on my terms, with new rules, and a new understanding. That love without listening isn't love, that showing up late doesn't undo absence, and that forgiveness doesn't always mean return. 3 weeks after James sent that message, we met at a lakefront park just outside downtown Portland. It was early evening. Spring was barely arriving, the trees still holding the memory of winter in their bare branches. The breeze was soft, familiar, and for once, I wasn't nervous. I wasn't preparing to defend myself. I was simply curious. James stood near the railing, watching the water. He turned when he saw me. His expression didn't carry the smugness I'd known growing up. He didn't smile too wide, or step forward with the effortless charm that always seemed to work on our parents. Instead, he looked hesitant, almost human. We sat on a bench facing the water. He held a coffee he hadn't touched. I sipped from a paper cup Maya had handed me on the way over. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said. I almost didn't. I answered honestly. James nodded. I get that. There was a long silence, but it didn't feel awkward, just necessary. Then he spoke. Lily was the one who made me look at everything differently. After I told her about the hospital, how Mom and Dad went to the party, she went quiet for a long time. Then she asked a question I hadn't expected. Would they have done the same thing if it had been you in the ICU? He paused, staring at the water like it might answer for him. And I realized they wouldn't have. I didn't speak. I just listened. Growing up, he continued, I didn't think about the way things were. I thought they were normal. I thought you were just quiet, that you liked being left alone, that you didn't care about the spotlight. He glanced at me then. But you weren't quiet. You were silenced. That word caught in my chest. Not shouted, not forced, silenced. And I didn't do anything, he said, voice low. I let it happen. I benefited from it. His eyes stayed on the lake. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Emily. I just needed to say it. Out loud. For a long moment, I said nothing, not because I was unsure, but because I was letting the truth settle, letting the words stretch into the space where denial used to live. You were the golden child, I said quietly. But that doesn't mean you were never trapped, too. He looked at me, eyes soft. I'm trying to unlearn it, he whispered. All of it. That's when I knew something real had shifted. He wasn't trying to erase the past. He wasn't asking for things to go back to normal. He was acknowledging that normal had never been fair to me. That evening didn't end with a dramatic hug or promises of being best friends again. It ended with something far rarer, a mutual understanding. We parted with no set plan, no expectations, just a shared willingness to try again, but this time, as equals. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to dinner at my parents' home. I didn't accept right away. I made it clear that I'd attend only under specific conditions 1 hour. No discussion of the past unless I brought it up, and no attempts to guilt me into closeness. Maya came with me. She waited in the car, just in case. The house was just as I remembered, neat, immaculate, and emotionally sterile. My mother greeted me with a brittle smile. My father offered a half-hearted pat on the back. The table was set too formally for the conversation we needed to have. They tried. In their way, they asked about my work, commented on the weather, spoke carefully, as if walking on glass. And I thought for a moment maybe something had shifted. But then, over dessert, my mother said it. So, are you still claiming that job stress affects your lupus symptoms? Or was that more of a phase? The words were soft, but the cut was deep. I placed my fork down gently, looked at both of them. Thank you for dinner, I said, standing. My father's face tightened. My mother began to protest. But I didn't wait. I walked out, just like I had from that hospital room months before. That night, I sent a short email. Last night was an example of the kind of dismissal I can no longer accept. If we're to try again in 2 weeks, it must be with respect for my reality. My mother replied the next day. You're right. I fell into old patterns. I'm sorry. We'll do better next time. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And I had finally learned the only way forward was on my terms. The 1 year mark came quietly. No fireworks, no dramatic countdown, just a soft morning and April sunlight curling through the windows of my new apartment, the smell of toast in the kitchen, and Maya humming to herself as she arranged mismatched plates on the table. We called it Phoenix Day, not because it was the day I nearly died, but because it was the day I stopped disappearing. That night, a small group gathered in my living room, Maya and Ryan, Al from the design team. A few neighbors who'd become family over shared soup and late-night conversations. We ate, laughed, and listened to music. Someone brought homemade brownies. Someone else brought a bottle of wine with a handwritten label for rising from ashes. At one point, I slipped away and walked into my bedroom. I opened the drawer where I kept the letter I wrote to my parents in the hospital, the one they found on the empty bed. I read it slowly. The anger in it was sharp, raw, true, but it didn't belong to me anymore. I folded it one last time and placed it in a small box. Then I opened a new page and began writing a letter to myself. It wasn't long, just a promise, a vow to honor the boundaries I'd fought so hard to set, to never shrink again for love, to never excuse silence that harms, to choose people who choose me. When I returned to the living room, they were waiting, not just for a toast, but for me, the real me, the one who finally knew her worth. I raised my glass and said, to staying, not just alive, but whole. And in that moment, I understood something I had chased my entire life. Validation doesn't come from being seen by those who never looked. It comes from choosing not to disappear when they don't. My parents still reach out sometimes. A card in the mail, a text around holidays. But now, I read those things with different eyes. I no longer read them for signs of change. I read them with boundaries, with clarity, with peace. James and I talk once a month. Slowly, honestly. He doesn't pretend we're something we're not. And that makes what we are feel more real. Maya still keeps tea in the cupboard I like. Ryan still fixes things without asking. Al still brings too much food on Tuesdays. And me, I still write, still design, still heal. But most importantly, I stay. In my life. In my truth. In the room where I am no longer at the edge of the frame. I am at the center where I've always belonged. And if you're listening now, wondering if you'll ever get there too, you will. Not because they'll change, but because you will. You'll stop asking to be chosen and choose yourself instead. And when you do, everything begins again. Sometimes, the people who should have protected you will be the ones who walk away first. But healing begins the moment you stop chasing them and start choosing yourself. If this story spoke to something buried deep in you, leave a comment and let me know you're here. And don't forget to like and subscribe, because the ones who rise from silence deserve to be heard.